Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Wednesday, May 11th. And on Wednesdays here on our daily podcast, we like to talk with people about faith and how their own faith compels them to the common good in this world that we live in. And today we're going to be talking about what we can do around reducing gun violence in the United States. I mean, it is something that has been a raging problem in the United States for a very long time. And our current situation of so many guns in our world affecting so many people, especially young people, especially young Black and brown people in the United States, is something that we all need to take more seriously and do something about. And today we're joined by Brenda K. Mitchell. Brenda is herself a person of faith. She's a pastor. She works with a great group that we're so proud of called Moms Demand Action. And hear me calling it Mam's Demand Action, Moms Demand Action. And Brenda is a pastor, and she's also someone who's experienced the impacts of gun violence herself in her own life. Brenda, so glad to have you willing to chat with us today about this and to put out a clarion call about what we can do around the issues of gun violence here in the United States. But as we often do, we like to start by talking about what's the weather condition where you are? And the reason we do this is because everybody experiences weather, right? It's one of the few things it feels like in our society that we all share in common is what's going on in the skies and the air above us and around us. So I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a lovely day, 68 already this morning at 10 o'clock a.m. and it's going to warm up to just a lovely spring day. How are things in the Chicago area?
Well, we're looking at 88 degrees today, and it has not been kind on my hair. So this is not a great hair day, but I'm here.
Well, Brenda, having just met you now, your hair looks great.
Well, thank
And
you.
I cover up my own, hair issues by wearing a hat all the time. Hey, Brenda, your own story is really powerful. Your son was a victim of gun violence. You've committed yourself to working with families who are impacted by gun violence, trying to message to people in the rest of the country around gun violence. Can you tell us a bit of that story and how you got into all this important work?
Yes, in 2005, we had just sent my other son, Kevin, overseas to fight his third conflict in war in Afghanistan, only for a week later to bring him back to bury his brother in a free country. And the irony of that, Kenneth had just gone out that evening. He was a single parent of two boys and another son that was born 30 days after Kenneth's death, who
Wow.
could not understand how everyone else knew his father but him. Kenneth had had a weekend off and was preparing for the Super Bowl. He was a manager at a golf course. And so they were preparing for a Super Bowl. And at that time, he just was enjoying the evening with a couple of his friends, shooting darts and just having polite conversation. As he exited the building, there was an argument in the parking lot of the facility. Nothing physical, just a verbal. The verbal ended up being that as Kenneth was trying to de escalate the conversation, another young man went to his car and picked up a gun and came back and just randomly started shooting.
Mm.
There were two victims. Kenneth was the only fatality in that incident. The other person was an innocent bystander as well.
That is such a tragic story. I'm so sorry for your loss. That being in 2005, I'd imagine you still feel that pain in different ways on a regular basis.
Yes, absolutely. And, for me, it did not hit me immediately because I had to realize I was relevant to his two sons that were still here and the other to be born. So I didn't really have the opportunity to grieve at that point, but it did hit me 12 years later, believe it or
Wow.
not, and threw me into, full-blown PTSD and
Yeah.
trauma. So that was difficult time for me. But yeah, absolutely.
Were you already tuned in to the issues of gun violence I mean, Chicago has been a city that has dealt with the impacts of gun violence for a long time. Were you already personally aware of all this and connected to the issue of guns?
You know what? I wish I could say I wasn't. However, I also lost a brother to gun violence. So
Wow.
I became my mother. My mother lived through it, and I watched the impact of that on her. And my faith told me that as difficult as it was for her, that God would also bring me through this. I would do it differently, but
Mm.
I would still have to rely on God to bring me through it.
So you're dealing with generations now of people who've been impacted by gun violence. Your grandchildren, your mother. I mean, people on both sides, or sons on both sides of your family. Your son that was in war. I mean, war
Yes,
is another way that gun violence shows itself, right, in our world. And there's just so much violence around, and the training and the use of guns. When people ask you, like, how should they think about this issue if they haven't had the kinds of experiences that you have? Um, do you have a pretty clear answer for what we should do about gun violence, or do you feel that it's something that's mm, more difficult for us to come to a place of a better way of thinking about guns in our society?
I think it's a difficult place, but I think it's necessary for us to really understand that, while we like to think of it as just a black and brown
Hmm.
issue, the crime is truly on humanity. We are a free country. And if our testimony cannot be any greater than this, then it's a sad statement of our legislative branch, which is responsible to the constituency that puts them in office. And so it's a failure on their part, not ours, because we keep sounding our voices and making it known in a free country, in a country that always talks about morality, that we're okay allowing mothers to bury their children, which is not the normal state of things. This is not what we do. We used to bury our
Yeah.
elders. Um, and this is not how our response should be to gun violence. We should not be okay with
Yeah.
seeing a whole generation of children being placed in the grave and then the other ones to the jail cell or back out on the street to perpetrate further crimes.
You remind me a lot of the history of Mother's Day, which, we just celebrated in this country a few days ago. And the history of Mother's Day was that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, mothers joined together through churches to call for the end of war because they were saying they're tired of burying their sons. That
Yes.
moms were saying, we have to do this differently. Now, since then, Mother's Day has not remained an anti-war movement. It has become a day where we
Right.
honor mothers for all their other great contributions. Um, but that impulse has been in our society for so long. And in fact, societies all around the world that have wanted for violence to come to an end and to address it very directly, and that mothers tend to be the ones who do that. And you're affiliated with a group called Moms Demand Action, and you're on the Faith Advisory Council for that group.
Yes.
To talk about how that group has been important to you and what its role has played in your own life.
It has been life changing for me, and it has saved my life
Mm,
because it has allowed me to have a voice. It has allowed me to move beyond myself and let my voice be heard. To have an understanding that Kenneth didn't die in vain. Kenneth, don't put a period behind his name because he's still
mm,
speaking. Because as long as his mother has the opportunity, and Everytown for gun safety and Moms Demand Action gave me that voice,
mm.
gave me that strength to rise up above myself and become an advocate for common sense gun laws, um, getting rid of ghost guns. It is the largest gun violence prevention organization in the
Yeah.
country with over 8 million supporters. And we've done a great job of keeping gun violence in the public eye.
And Everytown, that's the group that was started by Gabby Giffords and others. Is that right? That's the group.
Yeah, Shannon Renee has been the one of the grassroots um, leaders in this organization.
And there was a period when Gabby Giffords, who was a congresswoman, was shot, and and subsequently, started this effort and others to deal with gun violence in our society. There was a shooting at Congress people practicing baseball a few years ago. There have been
Hmm.
shootings in every context we can imagine in the United States: religious meetings, concerts, streets, like where Kenneth was killed, um, private homes, prayer meetings. There's hardly a place in our society that in the last dozen years you can't mark a gun violence activity. And I had thought previously that maybe what would move society was when certain people were affected by gun violence. Like maybe if Congress people are affected, they're going to move on some gun legislation. But it just seems like there's no place and no tragedy that could be great enough to get the political system to respond. Kindergartners being slaughtered isn't enough, right? So this change is going to have to come from something other than an escalating amount of crisis. What do you think it's going to take for us to put, gun legislation in place that will help protect people? Or do you think, as the gun rights people say, there's just no law that can do this. We have to deal with it at some other level in our society or something like that. Do you have a sense of that?
What I feel is that it's not enough. Um, you have to understand that 110 Americans are killed with guns and more than 200 are shot and injured. How can we say that this is not an issue? We are losing more people in this country than others are losing at a bona fide war. Um,
Yeah.
we have to be very conscious of what's going on in brown and black communities. And we all have to get on board and address the issue of gun violence. Um, it has not stopped with the pandemic. It has escalated to ungodly proportions, and yet we still say it is not an issue. Um, gun rights advocates don't understand that what we're doing is not a charge against their Second Amendment rights. My husband owns a gun. He understands his right in the Second Amendment, but he is irresponsible and always has been as a member of law enforcement and the military, a responsible gun owner. And that's all we're asking for. Pass common sense laws that will not allow us to bury our children in a moral country.
Do you, I know that very quickly these issues can just turn to legislation, like we're doing now. What what is the common sense or
Mhm.
common good policies that could be passed? And I know that sometimes that can feel distracting from the personal strife that's in all this. So I want to be careful not to do that. Do you have a really clear sense of some accomplishments that could be made by passing some legislation? It feels to me like one of the issues is we can't do this piecemeal. You can't have one city or one state having different gun laws than those who are right around them, because people move between cities and states, right? Nobody lives just simply in one location. And so as people move, so do all the things people own, including guns. So you can say, well, you can't buy a gun in Chicago, but you can buy a gun in other states and just drive it into Chicago. So it doesn't feel like we can accomplish this in a piecemeal fashion. Um, is the answer really to make something more consistent in every place in the country? Do you think that's the essential piece of this?
It has to be consistent. You're figuring Illinois has tough gun laws, but right on our border of Indiana, we see guns being trafficked into the Chicagoland area. We're not. Um, owners of gun um, buildings. We're not manufacturers, but yet guns are flowing into our area from other communities of states, such as Indiana, which is right on our border and has a pipeline. And then we license everything, but we don't want to license gun dealers or gun owners. You can't do my nails without a license. You can't do my hair without a license. You can't babysit without a license. But yet, it's okay for us to have something as critical as guns without a license. It
Yeah.
just doesn't make sense.
Uh, uh, I have long been just shaken and concerned by the other narratives in our society of not just people having guns, but of people shooting at each other. And I'm told regularly, and I think it's true, that you can't correlate certain activities like movies that people watch, television shows, games that they play with behavior. So it's not as simple as just saying if you play certain first person shooter video games, like the fact that we have a category of video games called first person shooter that turns you
Mhm.
into the shooter, or at the Mall of America near where I live, that there's a laser tag uh, game space in the mall that's enormous, and it's called urban combat. So you play
Yes.
role play that you're in a war zone in an urban environment, and you get to go in and shoot at each other. You can't correlate someone doing that activity, playing those games, watching certain movies, with then the person's going to turn around and go do those things. But it
Mhm.
seems to me that there's a desensitization. Like there's got to be something in our society that just is giving tacit approval to this approach. Not just that we have guns or that gun. And I'm a very avid. I think we should have less guns. I think we should regulate them at the highest level of a dangerous toxin in our society, like we do other toxins.
Right.
Do you have a sense of that? I mean, do you think that the other things we do in our society, from little kids growing up with toy soldiers or playing cowboys and Indians like when I was a kid, or playing Mortal Kombat, or going to the Mall of
Yes.
America and doing urban combat stuff, do you think that's a part of all this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because those games desensitize you. And so you no longer see people as human objects.
Yeah.
You see them as a game. And in a world where there is no absolutes anymore, you know, we're breeding and we're feeding in to this type. And those games are very violent. And so if I'm driving down the street, which we hear and we see drive-by shootings, I'm desensitized to that because why? I
Yeah.
see that on the video game that I've been playing since I was a kid, Mortal Kombat, all of that stuff. It's violent, and we're perpetrating that in this society.
Mhm.
And yet, we're not putting boundaries on it. We're not seeing a human face in that because everything is technology driven. And so, I'm just a person walking down the street, but I might as well be a piece of technology
Mhm.
because I don't have a human touch or a human sense of sensibility in some of the things that we do.
Yeah. I mean, I feel the same, and I know other people feel differently. I've been talking about this for years, and people just say it's just simply not, it doesn't work that way. And I don't think you can jump to those conclusions. I would just love to try it for a couple of decades. Like, we know
Yes,
the situation we have, and we know what our narrative has been in this country around shooting each other or shooting other human beings.
right.
What if we tried that? It just, as people who do social influence, which we all do, you're a pastor, I'm a pastor, we try to create context
Mhm.
that create a new social reality for people in all kinds of ways.
Right.
Artists do it, businesses do it. It just seems like that's got to be a piece. I'm not sure that goes far enough. I'm reminded that as both of us being Christian pastors, the Jewish scriptures start with the narrative of the Son of God and the
Mhm.
daughter of God having two sons, Cain and Abel, and one
Yeah,
kills the other, right? The whole
right.
story starts out with son of God has sons, son and daughter of God have two sons, and one kills the other. mean, that's,
Yeah.
you're talking about a quarter of the people in the story are murderers, and a quarter of them are victims of murder. So there's something, and I think that text wants us to see the human impulse of wanting to harm one another. And I'm struck by the fact that human beings are the only animals that I know that self-harm and harm others at a regular pace, right? So there's something in the human experience that predates all kinds of weaponry and all the rest of it. So for sure that's the case. And that's why I think, because that's the case, we need to be much more cautious of these other elements. How does your faith inform you on your thinking about this, whether it's the story of faith or your own obviously you've shared that your own personal life and faith and commitment to God and faith, hope, and love, and it has brought you to a place to be actively involved. But around this issue particularly, how does your faith compel you to think about it?
My faith has been the foundation and the anchor for me. And so when I'm exercising my faith, I have to exercise my faith with the hope that there is, as my dad said, what we do for the better good. Um, and if we don't understand that, and that we're called to service, all of us, and if it's happening to the least of us, it's happening to all of us. And and I often say, not one of us can do what all of us can do
Hmm.
together. And I think that Shannon Renee Watts, who actually is the founder of Moms Demand Action Network, took her heart at a kitchen table and created a movement
Hmm.
that has um, established the moral majority in
Yeah.
America, contrary to what we see uh, in the decline of the social morale.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
we've
we're
been
followers of that.
amen to that. And look, we've been at this for so long in this society. I'm 55 years old, and I think back to the big debates when I was a child in elementary school, in the 70s.
Mhm.
And handgun restrictions was a major conversation 40 plus years ago in this society. I know some people are coming to it more urgently now, and there's a lot of good reasons, because it has gotten more dangerous. Guns kill more people, both violence done to another person and self-inflicted violence, because that's another piece of it. The amount of
Yeah.
self-harm that is done, intentional self-harm with guns, is a very real part of the violence that's being done. But we've been talking about this and trying to deal with these issues for a very long time. And great groups like Everytown and Moms Demand Action are new on the scene and have made such tremendous impact. And yet it feels like we're just going nowhere with the broader conversation with people. Like, it just feels like we can't seem to get around these issues in a way in this country. So do you think we're in a place where it's like the coronavirus, like COVID, where we're going to have to say, we have to deal with this and try to keep it from reaching pandemic levels, but we're going to have to learn to live with it, that there's just baked in to the United States a culture of guns and a culture of violence, and the two are just with us permanently. And so we have to be mitigating that problem? Or do you have a more hopeful vision of what things could be?
You know what? I'm reminded of Abraham and Lot. And Abraham pleaded with God, if there be one, will you save the city? I think we have to be like that Abraham mentality and say, if there be one child, that we may be able to stand in front of that bullet and seize the action to stop. I have to be like Abraham.
Yeah.
If there be one that Everytown and Moms Demand Action saves by their advocacy, I want to be on the right side of history. I'm going to ask God, if there be one, will you save the city? That's who we are. That's who we are now. And that's the stance that each and every one of us take. You gotta have a passion for it, but you also have to be committed to what you. I've lost a brother, I've lost a son, and others would like you to think that that never happened. I actually
Mm.
had someone say that to me to my face. But the reality of it is that my son is no longer here. So it did happen. Um, how do we deal with it? You know,
Yeah.
I can't lose faith and I can't lose hope. Then
Hmm.
everyone else will have won.
Yeah. If other people are saying to themselves, "Hey, I would like to be more involved in this. I'm not sure what to do. I don't know. I don't have a personal experience with losing someone to gun violence in the way that Pastor Brenda has. I I'm not even sure where I go to do that, or what could I do. I mean, I could call my congressperson or call my senator or write a letter to the president, or I don't know, say something to the Supreme Court, to try to change the laws. But what can people do? What are the options that in Everytown and Moms Demand Action and the other groups that are in the ecosystem of dealing with gun violence? What can people do to be engaged in this?
If they're interested in getting involved, make it real simple for joining Moms Demand Action. All they have to do is to text READY, READY, to 64433, or visit us online at momsdemandaction.org. And there's a Mom Demand Action chapter in every state.
Hmm.
It's Yes, we have like 700 local groups across the country. So it's easy to get involved in what Shannon says. It's like it's not a marathon, it's a movement. And so we challenge them to get engaged and get involved. Don't let it come to your neighborhood in order for you to get involved. Now's the time.
So I just did that while you were talking here. I typed in 6433 into my phone and typed and sent the word ready. And what I got back was, give us your zip code. And so I'm
Yeah.
guessing that what it's going to do is it's going to start me down a journey. And this is for Moms Demand Action. Uh, as much
Yes.
as I support the group, I'm not a mom. Is Moms Demand Action only for moms?
No, not at all. We have some great dads out there that do the work, and we even have a student branch of Moms Demand Action. Students demand action. We've
Mm-hmm.
got dads out there. Um, Anybody that has a desire to work on changing what we see in terms of gun laws and advocacy are invited to join us.
What kinds of things will I've filled it out, and I gave him my name, gave him my email, literally in the amount of time it took us right here to be talking. That's why I was looking down. So whatever that was, 30 seconds, I think I'm signed up. Um, what's going to happen now? What am I going to run into? Am I going to be invited to online groups, to in-person meetups? Are you going to send me videos to share? What happens in the flow of, now that I'm a non-mom in the Moms
You're
Demand Action
You're
flow?
a non-mom, and we're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Now someone will be reaching out to you. They will share with you the local groups that are available. We have several different committees that you can join. There's legislation. There's faith, as which I'm part of that survivor membership league. There's so much that you can get involved in. The research, um, data. There's so many areas that we have opportunities for you to help support the work that we do.
You being a pastor and being on the Faith Advisory Council, are there is there material ways to be involved that are specially curated for people who want to connect their faith with this issue? Is that a
Yes,
subgroup somewhere in the flow?
yes, yes. I'm also, faith um, advisory council, as you indicated, but um, we get together during our annual conferences, and we sometimes do special things to invite people in as well as a faith community. And so, and we reach out to the faith communities in our local areas. I have presented at churches. I've done
Mm,
functions at churches. I've shared the information with churches, municipalities, and educational groups. But to allow our faith to be in operation, sometimes we have to move beyond the four walls. And I'm a field minister. So I'm out there with social justice
yeah.
and making it known that I'm challenging what I see. It's not just enough to say, I believe in eradicating gun violence. I
Mm,
believe in being actively involved in eradicating gun violence. I don't want to do a funeral. I'd rather
mm,
celebrate a life,
that's
so
great. That's a great phrase. I don't want to have to do a funeral. I'd rather celebrate a
yes,
life. Brenda, before we started live streaming and recording here, you suggested to add the letter K between Brenda and Mitchell, so it's Brenda K. Mitchell. And some people do that because it's branding, which is fine. It's how they get separated out from, I know the other couple of Brenda Mitchells in the world. But you said this sort of passing comment that I wanted to ask you about. You said, I include the K there in honor of my father. Can you say something about that? What does the K mean? In that, what's that special K in your name?
yes. As a little girl, my dad always called me either Brenda K or BK. Those was his terms of endearment for me.
Mm,
And as I grew in the ranks as a professional, I realized how important that K was to me. And
mm,
so I started using the K in honor of my father's term of endearment toward me. And so I'm pretty adamant about that
awesome.
K because it represents the relationship between my father and I.
I love that. I love that so much. Well, Brenda Kay, thank you for sharing with us today. Thanks for all this really great work. It's just it seems so important, and frankly, I am sorry for you and for all the other moms who've had to who've lost a child due to these issues. That we ask the victims then of this violence to be the ones to solve it, and it just feels like that's something that in a society where rights are not the only obligations that we have, right? So
Yes.
it's
And
been an
thank you. And I'm extremely happy to represent Everytown. Shannon Watts, who, is our founder, and the work that she started at her kitchen table that has made us all evolutionaries.
it's evolutionary. It's a great phrase. Um, we'd love to have you on again sometime to talk about the complexities of trauma. I know that's something you mentioned at the beginning, and
Yes.
Betsy's found you on Twitter already after watching this and has raised that you recognize trauma. Um, Something my wife is very engaged in. We've adopted two sons through the foster care system, and so that gave us some
Mm,
invitation to think about trauma differently than we had decades ago. And when you start to see the world through the lens of trauma and
yes.
trauma responses, some things start to make a little more sense. There's a different way to organize an understanding of the world. Can you just say a word or two about that now, and then we'd love to have you on again to talk more about the issues of trauma and complexity of trauma. But would you say a few words about that?
Absolutely. I realized in my own evolution the reality of trauma in my life, and that 12 years into my grieving process, I never grieved for my son. And I experienced PTSD, complicated grief and trauma. One isolated incident threw me off physically and emotionally. And I had to go back and recapture myself. And in realizing what that has done for me, I started even, believe it or not, in Everytown. I kind of moved out a little bit from the gun violence movement and moved into trauma
Yeah.
and trauma informed resources for survivors. Um, and now I help facilitate groups for trauma in survivors, bereaved parents, and helping
Mm,
them to get through their complicated grief and mourning process. So it's
right.
something I almost died 3 times in that process. And so it became a passion of mine. And so I do speaking engagements on it and bring it to the forefront and keep it in front of legislators as well to make sure that we have resources available to parents and siblings who have lost children to gun violence.
Yeah, we many of us have become familiar in the last 2 decades with
Mhm.
the phrase PTSD, right? Post traumatic stress disorder. And that was because of the war in Afghanistan and
Right,
Iraq, right? It came to the United States. We started to see it. It's been around a long time. They used to call it other things, after World War I and World War II in Korea and Vietnam.
right.
But it became a part of the parlance. And so people get it and they respond to it, and the DMS 4 and 5 and so on, like in the medical health and mental health world, knows how to respond to it. And there's a lot of training. It feels like in our current day, this phrase that you used is now coming to a lot of people's understanding the way PTSD did previously. And that's the phrase trauma informed, and then you fill in the blank. So trauma
Yes.
informed therapy or trauma informed faith communities. My wife leads some trauma informed yoga classes. But that
Hmm.
idea that trauma informed, topic, uh, that feels like a real advancement in the area of trauma. And that is to say that it's not that trauma is a separate topic. It's
Yeah.
recognizing that trauma influences or informs so many other parts of our lives. And that if we don't think about it in these integrated ways, it's going to show up. It's going to pop back up. Is that how you think about that phrase, trauma informed?
Absolutely, because one of the things is that when you find yourself in this situation, everybody tells you about a new norm. There is no such thing as a new norm when one part of you is outside of you. And what I have instructed and I have shared through this process is that we have to create a new narrative that will allow us to see ourselves again, a new narrative that will allow us to create a space for us to be happy again, which
Yeah.
is a very difficult thing to do because you're right. You always go back to that moment of trauma because
Mhm.
that's where you left everything that you love. And you move forward. I was traumatized. An isolated incident put me in a space that I never thought that I would be in. Even as a mother, you kind of think that if it's touched my family once, I'm not expecting it to touch me twice,
Hmm.
but it did. It didn't even miss a generation. It came directly to me. So,
Well, Pastor Brenda K. Mitchell, thank you so much for
thank
all this
you.
good time, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. And thanks all for being a part of the Common Good faith conversation here on this Wednesday. And we'll
Thank you
talk to
so
you all
much,
tomorrow.
and I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, dear. Bye bye.